Model Global 2024 is being delivered by an award-winning, multi-award-winning, I should say, best-selling historian and a prolific author. He's also an art historian, a broadcaster, and a photographer, all rolled into one. The Scottish man who fell in love with India, the man who co-founded the prestigious Jaipur Literature Festival. Extremely proud to present to you, William Dalrymple. And that is the name of his latest book. I'll let him do the rest of the talking.
Only in Kerala would a historian get invited to a tech conference. I have to confess, this is my first tech conference. This is not the places that I usually hang out. So thank you very much for not leaving the hall as I got up here. There is a tenuous link with what's being talked about in the rest of the conference. I will be talking about the tech startups of the Gupta and Chera eras. The guys who came up with the brilliant ideas quite a while ago. Because India is not only now, for the first time, coming up with incredibly innovative ideas. India is one of those parts of the world which, very early on in history, answered the big questions of mankind. Why are we here? How do we live a moral life? What is the relationship of the earth to the heavens and the planet? What is the size of the earth? How do we measure the earth? The sort of questions which techies today try and design apps for were things that were examined by a few civilizations. Ancient Greece, ancient China, but also ancient India. The difference is that while Greece's contribution was spread around the world and made known by the British colonials and other European colonials such as the French, Portuguese and the Dutch. And while China has been very good at telling its story, India, I think, has been much less good at getting its message out into the world about its contributions to global history, the great things which India came up with. And it's worth asking why that is. Why is it that when you go to America, everyone has heard of Archimedes and Pythagoras, but no one has heard of Brahmagupta or Aryabhatta? Why is it that when everyone thinks of global trade in the pre-modern period, they think of the Silk Road leading to Shanghai, but no one thinks about Maziris, other than a few Malus who happen to have gone to Putnam and seen P.J. Cherian's great excavation. And I think there are a number of reasons for this. First of all, I think obviously British colonialism plays a role in this story. The generation of Macaulay famously said that a single shelf of a good English library is worth all the native literature of India and Arabia. That Victorian ideology depressed and repressed and oppressed, in fact, the image of India in the world. The idea that Indians came up with some of the great ideas of civilization was a difficult one for the British to equate with their own civilizing mission. How could you civilize a place which had been civilizing the rest of the world for thousands of years? So in a sense, it was important for people like Macaulay to undermine the contribution of India. But I think this map, the map of the Silk Roads, is something in our own day which has played a major role in undermining Indian primacy and Indian agency in the early centuries. The map is in itself a wonderful thing, and it's something that attracted my generation. When I left university, the first thing I did was to follow Marco Polo exactly along the dotted line at the center of this map. But it is an idea which has been extended to the point that it can front of you represent an untruth, a lie. This map, taken at random from one of the many recent books on the Silk Road, and we should say this is something that is very current. If you go to London at this moment, there are two big shows on. One in the British Museum called the Silk Roads, another in the British Library called the Silk Road Oasis. In both of those, variants of this map are on display, which show a dotted line leaving the Mediterranean in the classical period, because places like Petra and Palmyra were Roman cities, or cities which flourished during the time of the Roman Empire, and then crossed through Persia and Central Asia, through the deserts of the Gobi Desert and the Taklamakan and over the Pamirs to the South China Sea. And as you can see in this map, this is done at the expense of India. India, in this map, has no cities. There are no ports in India. All the important places of trade are hundreds of miles to the north of India. All India has, in fact, is the Himalayas in this map. Even the dotted line to the south, the maritime Silk Road, a new addition to these Silk Road maps, just bypasses India. You can see it passing directly past Trivandrum as it heads up the coast towards Bombay and Kerala. Now, this idea that there was a flourishing trade route which connected Rome and China, but which ignored and missed India, is quite simply a historical untruth. We know that China and Rome had no clear ideas of each other's existence. There was never an embassy leaving early China, Han China, heading for Rome, or from Rome heading towards Han China. But there was, and this is very important, a regular fleet of merchant ships which left the Red Sea coast and travelled here to Kerala, specifically to Maziris, somewhere around Cochin or Kadangallur. And if you look at this new map out of All Souls, Oxford, this summer, this is a map of Roman coin hoards. This is the reality of Roman trade as recorded by archaeology. And as you can see, as you'd expect, a lot of Roman coin hoards found in Italy, France, Spain, Greece, the Balkans, around the Mediterranean. Falling off to the north as you go up to Scandinavia, falling off to the south as you head into the Sahara. But a line of, this pointer work, not very well. A line of coins found down the Nile. But look to the east. Not a single Roman coin found in China. Not one. But compare that to India and Sri Lanka at the bottom of this map. Orange dots all over this coastline, because Roman merchants arrived here directly down the Red Sea to trade with India with every monsoon wind. And we need to rethink this map completely on the basis of recent archaeology and scholarship. We can forget, in the early centuries, the Silk Road. It certainly existed at the time of the Mongols. Marco Polo passed along that road in the 1270s after the Mongols had smashed a hole through the middle of Asia. But in the classical period, it was not China, it was India, specifically Kerala, that was the focus of Roman trade. So we're going to look at three big ideas that India came up with that it exported in this early period. We're going to look first at the idea of Buddhism, which in many ways was India's most successful export. We're then going to look at the ideas of Hindu kingship and Sanskrit and the whole package of Sanskritic literature, which takes over Southeast Asia for 1,000 years. For 1,000 years, every country, every city between Afghanistan and Bali is Sanskrit literate. And Sanskrit is the principal diplomatic language in that vast area, in that Indosphere. And finally, we're going to look at stuff closer to what you guys have been discussing. Early Indian math and science. And how Indian ideas of zero and the Indian numeral system invented here in India spreads first to the Arab world and then very late on in the story to Europe in the 13th and 12th centuries. So we'll start with Buddhism. So the Buddha was a historical character. He lives in the mid-5th century BCE on the Gangetic Plain. He's born in Lumbini, which is just over the border now into Nepal. He gets his enlightenment, of all places, in Bihar, at Bodh Gaya, and he then preaches his first sermon in UP, a little bit before Yogi Adityanath, at Sarnath, just outside Varanasi. But one of the strange things about Buddhism is it's almost invisible for its first 200 years. We have not one single inscription, not one structure that we can definitely point to and say unequivocally, this is a Buddhist stupa, this is a Buddhist Chaitya hall, this is a vihara. It's only about 250 BC, with the accession of Ashoka, that suddenly the lights go on. Suddenly you get these substantial monuments in marble, polished stone, Chunar sandstone, with these very Persian lions, which are on everybody's passport, everybody's banknotes to this day. The wheel of the law, which is still, the chakra, still on your flag. And Ashoka not only personally converts to Buddhism, and then writes a whole series of inscriptions, where previously there's complete silence, suddenly there's waterfalls of words down all these Buddhas, down the rock shelters, covering every early Buddhist monument, giving one first-person ideas. But he also spreads his ideas through what he calls Dharma ministers. And out of India, right across Turkey, through the Middle East, into as far as Cyrene, he sends what he calls his Dharma ministers. What we would call missionaries, taking the Buddhist faith. And we know that they got as far as Libya, which is a long way from India in ancient times. But he also sends them southwards, south through India. At Baja, outside Pune, we get this extraordinary early monastery recording the lost Indian architecture in bamboo and in wood, which existed before the stone was used. And we can see the early forms of Buddhist architecture here, which are now lost. These extraordinary balconies and fretwork, columns, this deep vihara with the stupa in the middle. And it's in this period that we begin to see, for example, the Ajanta paintings, these gorgeous images of Padmapani, the Bodhisattva with the lotus at his chest. It's also at this period, during Ashoka's reign, that we begin to see, this is not working suddenly. Can I have some help from one of the tech team? It's not going forward anymore. Can we have someone to help with the laptop? Here we are. This is working now. Here we go. And it's also at this period that we see the Dharma spreading to Sri Lanka. Mahinda, the son of Ashoka, converts the king of Anuradhapura, and suddenly Sri Lanka becomes a Buddhist land. As recently as last year, Mahinda's own stupa turns up in the jungles of Rajagala, in the center of Sri Lanka, with a Brahmi inscription. And this, if you like, is the prototype stupa. It's older than any other stupa we have. Look at this very crude, simple ring of stone over a cremation. That predates, for example, the stupas on the left, which we're more familiar with, these bell shapes that you see all over Burma and Thailand and so on. So by the time that Ashoka is dying and the time that Mahinda is dying, Sri Lanka has become a major center of Buddhist export. And this is the map which shows the miracle that takes place over the next few generations. This is Indian soft power at its most spectacular. It's difficult to think of any other period of history when Indian ideas make more of an impact than they do in the 100, 200, 300 years after the death of Ashoka. Out of the Gangetic plains, you see Buddhist ideas passing first up into Gandhara and Afghanistan and Pakistan through to Bactria, into Central Asia, what's now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, through China, to Japan, Korea, down through Burma, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, even the Philippines. Within 300 or 400 years, all these areas have converted to Buddhism, and with Buddhism comes not just ideas of how to avoid suffering and the philosophy of the Buddha, but a whole package of Indic ideas about time, about numbers, about how you measure the world, how you measure cosmology, ideas of karma, spread out over a vast area. Never again will Indian soft power be so incredibly powerful as it is at the time that this map is built. And recently we've seen Buddhist remains turning up further than we ever imagined. This gorgeous head with the Buddha's tortellini curls drilled in a workshop in Alexandria in Egypt, but found at the port of Berenike on the Red Sea. And here is the map of what's going on by the 1st century AD. This is based on the lonely planet of Roman times, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. And you can see all the way down the coast, west coast of India, but particularly here at Maziris, on the coast of Kerala, a whole line of ports which Roman ships made their way to in great fleets of 250 vessels from the time that Cleopatra commits suicide and the Romans seize Egypt. Suddenly, with the seizure of Egypt, they have got a border with India. And thanks to the monsoon winds, it takes only 2 months to move from Kerala all the way up to Roman Egypt. The reason being the top of the map, Tibet. Tibet freezes over at this time of year, cold winds break in. In spring it thaws and warm winds blow out. And those bellows, that forward in and out motion, predictable every 6 months, means that India has a unique gift that no other country has in this period. The winds blow in one direction fast for 6 months, and then miraculously they reverse. So for a sailor who's learned to sail those winds, you can get from Maziris to Egypt in 2 months. You then have to wait, go to the pyramids, go and see a show in Alexandria, sell your goods, whatever you want. And then by August the winds reverse, and you can sail back with equal speed. So while it would take 2 or 3 years to go by a camel over land between Egypt and anywhere in India, to get from Kerala or Gujarat or Sindh to the Roman Empire was a very easy matter, so much so that that Strabo talks about when he went on a voyage with the new governor of Egypt in the 1st century, he saw 250 vessels waiting for the winds to turn so that they could sail to India. 250 vessels sailing directly from Egypt to Kerala. Pliny, at this period, Roman naval commander, talks about how India, he says, is the drain of all the precious metals in the world. He complains that your Malu ancestors were basically ripping off my European ancestors by overpricing their pepper to such an extent that the wealth of Rome was draining into Indian pockets the same way that European and American wealth has been draining for the last 30 years into Saudi Arabia because of oil. Pepper, ivory, silk and cotton were high-value products that were made here very cheaply. You could gather pepper off a vine with no price. Elephants were so common in this part of the world that you could gather 100 tons of ivory effortlessly and sell it at an enormous premium to the Romans. And so India becomes incredibly rich from the first century for 300 years as Rome's principal trading partner. It's not just India and Rome, there are others on the way. We often forget the existence of Ethiopia, which in this century is a major power. If you go to Aksum, look at this map again. You can see just where the Red Sea comes in here, Meroe, Adulis, Aksum. These were major capitals in first century Ethiopia. We have pictures of Ethiopians arriving at Buddhist stupas and Buddhist courts in India. But this new discovery, the Busiris Papyrus, is the most important document because it allows us to give us figures to this trade. The Busiris Papyrus is a random shipping invoice that happens to have survived, taken out by an importer in Alexandria in Egypt about a single container which was leaving Kerala in about 150 CE. It contained 200 tons of ivory, 200 pots of black pepper, loads of silk, cotton. We actually have images of the great Indian exports at this time because a merchant who was involved in the trade commissioned a mosaic of it in Sicily. And here in Sicily we actually have an image of the India trade in one single image. At the center is a yakshi, which is, in this case, is meant to be a personification of India. It's based on one of the very sensuous yakshis that you see coming in the art of Mathura at this period. You can see she's like the Mathura image, she's touching a tree, she's a tree spirit, and the tree is blossoming. Just as in this image you can see a blossom coming out of her hand, you can see the trees blossoming as she touches the tree. She is got around her waist silk. Now silk is one of the items that Pliny says was an Indian product which was impoverishing Rome. Why? Because he says that the decadent women of Rome, this guy's, remember, a naval commander, he's like a kind of army brat. He's quite a Puritan. He doesn't like kind of liberals in the capital being decadent. And he says it is these decadent women in Rome wearing this immoral new textile silk, which is draining our coffers. All our gold that we make is ending up in Indian hands because these women wear these see-through garments. And the yakshi is indeed wearing it. And you can see the shape of her leg through the semi-transparent weaves. Behind the yakshi is pepper, the main product of this state in this century. Pepper is the vines coming behind the yakshi. In her arms are ivory, and we have circus animals, which is another major product of India. So all these items together are in this one container on the ship, the Hermapulon, recorded on the shipping invoice from 150 AD, the Busiris Papyrus. And it gives a snapshot of the way that your Malu ancestors were making a fortune in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Not through tech, but through exporting these luxury products. And the cost is astonishing. What has most surprised historians on reading this document is the enormous price paid by Romans for these products. gathered very cheaply here, sold at enormous hikes by the time it reaches Rome. In fact, if this one container actually did make it through to Alexandria, the importer would have been the Elon Musk of Roman Egypt. He could have bought any estate in Egypt or in central Tuscany and have had enough money left over to join the Senate. Then the third column that this document has is the customs take. What the Roman state is charging the merchants to import these things. And that is also the big surprise, because the Roman state took 1/3, 30%. And economic historians are now calculating that maybe as much as 1/3 of the entire Roman budget came from the import taxes and customs on the Red Sea coast. So the Appian Way, the Roman roads, the Colosseum, the Rhine frontier, all of this was paid for by the imports, the taxes on imports from luxury goods coming from India, particularly Kerala, into Rome. So it's a whole completely different picture. And we see these products from India turning up all over archaeological sites. This is a yakshi from North India, probably in the area around Sanchi, which turned up in Pompeii. But we also see the reverse. We see Roman products turning up in archaeological excavations this is from Afghanistan. Here we have a picture of a gladiator, the Pharos Lighthouse in Alexandria, and the Roman wine harvest. This turns up, of all places, in Bagram, under the American Air Force Base in Afghanistan. Taken by ship to the mouth of the Indus, punted up the Indus and the Kabul River, and found in a royal goodie cupboard in Bagram, under the airbase. And that is why we see specifically Roman Egyptian art reflected. At the bottom here we've got a Coptic papyrus of Jesus and his disciples, and then in the top you've got the same imagery, a Buddhist image with the Buddha and his disciples found in modern Afghanistan. This is the same time that the first Jews and the first Christians arrive in Kerala on the same trade routes going backwards and forwards. The story of St. Thomas arriving in Kerala dates from this time. But we also have the reverse. We have Buddhism now turning up in Egypt. And it's thanks to Roman imports that we see a change in Buddhist art. What had been iconic, the stupa, or the flame of the pillar of fire, or the wheel of the law, the three ways that people showed the Buddha in early Buddhist art, transforms into the icon of the Buddha that we recognize today in the 1st century under the influence of Roman art. And the Buddha's first image is based on the image of Apollo imported from Rome. So when you see these gorgeous Gandharan sculptures in museums, they look like Roman senators. Their faces are those of Roman sculpture. Here on the left we've got an image of Augustus from the 1st century, and look how similar the drapery is to that of the Bodhisattva in the middle picture. It's almost identical. It's two very different worlds. One is a Roman emperor, one is a Bodhisattva, apparently worlds apart, and yet look, the drapery is almost identical. So as we head on up, we have Indian monks, Indian Buddhists coming from North India into Afghanistan. This is the site of Mezainak, which is one of the very, very earliest Indian Buddhist sites in Afghanistan. Not only are the Buddhist stupas and viharas, Buddhist monasteries, there are also chapels to Durga. Early Hindu temples traveling along these routes. And then up through Bamiyan, where the Taliban destroyed the Buddha just before 9/11, and into China. And by the 1st and 2nd century, Buddhism is flourishing in China. By the 3rd and 4th century, we're seeing the Chinese copying Indian Gupta art. So on the left here, you've got an image of the Bodhisattva with all his drapery. On the right, a Chinese copy. And suddenly you find Indian deities, Indian Gandharvas, Indian Apsaras appearing and flying over the domes of Buddhist temples across China. Some of the monks are sincerely smoking something pretty strong, judging by the colors of some of these murals and these images of the Buddha with flames pouring out of his shoulders. And this is the man who changes everything. The monk Xuanzang is an extraordinary figure. He comes to India because he wants to know the unexplicated truth about Buddhism. He feels that the Buddhist texts in China are corrupted. So where does he go? He walks across the Gobi Desert, he walks through Kashmir, and he arrives eventually in 1st century Bodh Gaya, and eventually makes his way to the monastery University of Nalanda. Now Nalanda is this extraordinary place. Monks from all over the Buddhist world come to Nalanda to study. It is the Harvard, the Ivy League, the NASA of the 5th and 6th century AD. Moreover, the plan of this monastery, with these courtyards, giving on to cloisters, giving on to rooms, is the plan of the university that will then pass itself on to Islam as the plan of a madrasa, and from that on to Western universities. Think of the plan of an Oxford or Cambridge college, or indeed their copies in Harvard or Yale. The same plan of a courtyard, a cloister, and the scholars' rooms around the cloister. This is an Indian invention that travels. So when you go to Trinity College, Cambridge, or Bodleian, or the Bodleian Library, or to the Balliol College, Oxford, this plan, developed in India, is still the plan of universities today. And Xuanzang is dazzled by what he sees. He sees the 7-story library full of the Vedas, logic, grammar, philosophy, medicine, metaphysics, divination, mathematics. And we have from Nalanda this copper plate recording the establishment of a college at Nalanda under the patronage of the King of Indonesia, Srivijaya. He gives money so that you can have a college for expatriates, Southeast Asians and Indonesians coming to study in India at Nalanda. It's an extraordinary survival. And yet, this place, which is so central, the biggest library, the center of learning in Asia, in Bihar, has only had 10% of itself excavated. 90% remains to be discovered. So goodness knows what we'll find there. One of the great scandals that this government, which claims to be so keen on promoting India's great culture in the past, has never bothered to give the Archaeological Survey money to complete these excavations or to build decent museums across the country. So much more remains to be discovered. Anyway, when he gets home, Xuanzang, arriving with 8 elephants full of manuscripts, enough to build a whole new monastery library in Shanghai, finds a very unexpected ally, and it's this woman, Wu Zetian. Wu is only 15 years old, a 5th-ranking concubine. But she will change history because she will come to power, the only woman to seize power in China under her own right, the only female emperor. She will come to power and she will make Buddhism the state religion of China. She will demote for a generation the Confucians and the Taoists and make Buddhism the senior faith of the Chinese state. And we can't get much of an idea of the politics of the time looking at the Chinese pictures, but you get much more of an idea of what's going on looking at the modern Chinese soap opera. And Xuanzang adopted Wu Zetian as his protege. And she, first of all, jumps from the bed of the Emperor Taizong on the left to his son, Gaizong, on the right. And then, when he dies, she seizes power with the aid of the London-trained Indian alumni from the London. So you have both Indian and Chinese students from the London running this think tank called the Scholars of the Northern Gate, which bring about a coup d'etat in the heart of the Chinese state, leading to an Indian takeover for one generation of the Chinese state. It's an extraordinary moment in history, and one that people, I don't think, have made nearly enough of. So, the 660s is in China the high watermark of Indian influence. For one generation, you have a woman emperor who relies on Indian-trained monks to make prophecies. She is the reincarnation of nature. She is the Messiah come to rescue China. Now, there is a backlash after she falls from power and her son takes over. But that is the high watermark of Indian influence, the mid-7th century. At the same time, we see Indian ideas taking over Southeast Asia. We talked about how dominant India was in the trade in the early centuries with Rome. When Rome falls in the 5th century, there is a major economic crisis in India. No longer are these gold pouring into Indian pockets from Rome. So the Tamil trading guilds, which operate here in Kerala and in Chalukya lands in the middle and in the Tamil Pallava ports of Kanchipuram and the area south of Madras, they pivot eastwards. And it's at this period that you find Indian merchants looking for gold in Southeast Asia, Suvarnabhumi. Today, when you go to Thailand, the airport is called Suvarnabhumi Airport. That's a reference to the time when Indians were coming looking for gold in these places, Bujang, Palembang, Keling, and Kutai. So the whole of the Indian trading network pivots east, and suddenly you have large numbers of Indians turning up in ships like this. And from the 5th century, exactly the same period as the fall of Rome, you suddenly start to see evidence of Indian religions in Southeast Asia. You see Buddhists turning up in Thailand with the Wheel of Law and Dvaravarti, what's now Bangkok. You see both Buddhist and Shiva lingams and yonis and images of Shiva turning up in Malaysia, in Bujang. But most of all in the Mekong Delta, you see the beginnings of Hindu temples. Here, Angkor Paray, the first Hindu temple in the 5th century, is built. Inside it are these incredible images of Lord Vishnu. But it's not quite the Lord Vishnu we're used to. He's wearing a Khmer outfit. In another image, the Emperor Jayavarman II, the Khmer Emperor, paints himself as Vishnu, something that would be regarded as high blasphemy here. And this is what's happening. In court after court, the Brahmins are converting the local king with the Abhisheka ceremony. Here you can see the pots over his shoulder as they pour water onto him, making him a Hindu king. So kings that have been called things like Kodunga suddenly become Ullavarman. Suddenly Sanskrit becomes the language of sacred and of secular domestic business. And the Brahmins bring their South Indian scripts. Alava Granta script developed in Kanchipuram, the South Indian curvilinear script, which also creates the script for this area, takes off in Southeast Asia and becomes the basis for every pre-Islamic script in Southeast Asia. Mon, Khmer, Pyu, Thai. The whole of Southeast Asia has the scripts based on the Pallava script of Kanchipuram. And what are these Brahmins doing here anyway? Because are they not meant to cross the Black Water? Well, what they do is that they move the boundaries of India. And what you find is that the Mekong gets made into a new Ganga. Ma Ganga in Khmer is Mekong. And the headwaters of the Ganga are sacralized through the sculpting of yonis and lingams in the headboard. So the Brahmins can argue that they're not leaving India because they're still on the Ganges. So a new Ganges is born in the Mekong. A new Kurukshetra comes up outside Laos. A new Ayodhya is built on where Thailand is. And all the major Shaivite shrines reappear as step pyramids in the Khmer area. And the temples of southern India are built again in Java, in Cambodia, in Laos, in Thailand. On the left we've got the Shore Temple at Mahabalipuram. On the right we've got an almost identical temple in Java. You suddenly have whole sequences from the Ramayana being sculpted in Prambanan, but now larger than any temples in India. By the 9th century, the mega kingdoms of Srivijaya and the Khmer Empire, which don't tell Mr. Modi, it's the Khmer Empire, which is the largest Hindu empire ever. Not anything in this country. The Khmers have an entire landmass of Southeast Asia. Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam is controlled from Angkor Wat. And not only do we have the largest Buddhist monument at Borobudur, built in Java, this extraordinary monument seen from the air in the shape of a mandala that's 5 stories high, but you get the largest Hindu temple in the world built in Angkor Wat. Angkor Wat is a Vishnu temple, originally. It's covered with images of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. The area within the outer moat is 4 times the size of the Vatican City. It is Indic in every detail, and yet it's also unfamiliar. When Tagore goes there, he says, everywhere I could see India, yet I could not recognize her. Because it's taken on its own form. The Hinduism of Southeast Asia is different than the Hinduism of India. When you go to Bali today, some of the rituals are very unfamiliar. Some of the ways of worship are very unfamiliar. It is slightly different. So finally, we've done Buddhism, we've done the spread of Sanskrit Hinduism. The final story is the story of Indian mathematics and theory. And it is with the Gupta dynasty that we see the development of mathematics. The same dynasty which produces the wonders of Kalidasa and indeed the Kama Sutra also produces the work of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. Aryabhatta comes up with the exact circumference of the Earth, the exact distance between the Earth and the Moon, and the fact that the Earth spins on its own axis 1,000 years before Galileo. Brahmagupta defines zero. The idea of zero as a placeholder has been around for a while, but the idea specifically that zero is a number and therefore has its own rules. It's the number you get when you subtract a number from itself, and so on. Brahmagupta, sitting in Mount Abu in Rajasthan, defines it. And we get zero turning up on monuments from this time. The very earliest one is, ironically, in Cambodia, the little dot in the second row in the middle. That's the oldest dated zero we have. Here again, we have the first dated zero in India, in Gwalior, in the 8th century. And this is a map that should be taught in every school, not just in India, but across the world. Because this is how we get our numbers. It starts off with the Brahmi script. The Gwalior inscription is the next stage. And then it splits in 3 different directions. There's the Sanskrit Devanagari numbers, which continue on in this country. In the middle we have the East Arabic numbers, which derive again from this Indian model, which is what the numbers of Saudi Arabia and Iraq and so on is today. And then in Morocco and Spain, we have the West Arabic numbers, which by the 16th century become the familiar numbers we all have on our phones, on our computers. How does it get from India to the Middle East? Well, it probably, a Disney character takes them. Any of you that have children would have maybe put on the Disney Aladdin. Well, Jafar, the minister with the parrot, is in fact a historical character. His family was the hereditary viziers of Baghdad. Before that, They were Buddhist abbots in Afghanistan and were Sanskrit literate. When they come to power in Baghdad, they send to Sindh, the nearest Hindu kingdom, and they get brought the books of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta, which arrive in 776 in Baghdad. All around the Arab world, people begin to read these texts, but it's only when Al-Khwarizmi produces a brilliant, very simple prose translation that we get this really taking off. Al-Khwarizmi writes a book that he calls the Compendious Book of Calculation by Completion and Balancing according to Hindu calculation. Now that is a bit of a mouthful, so people know it by its nickname, Algebra. The basis of our word algebra. Al-Khwarizmi's name is the basis of our word, a word that's been touted around this conference for the last 3 days, algorithm. This is the origin of that word. And it spreads, along with another Indian import, chess, across the Islamic world. From Sindh, on the right of the map, to Baghdad. Al-Khwarizmi is from beneath the Aral Sea, and it passes right across North Africa, and by the 10th century has reached Spain. And the first Christian scholars study these numerals, the Indian method of numbers, the modus indorum, in the 10th century. But amazingly, for another 200 years, they continued to use the Roman numbers in Europe. So still XV, XC1, CV, XV, MMM, and all that sort of thing. And it's only when a young man is brought by his father to study in Algeria. He's from Pisa in Italy. His father is founding a trading colony. They're an expat family. The kid goes to the local school. And luckily, that kid is Fibonacci. Fibonacci picks up the Indian number system in Al-Khwarizmi's version of it in Algeria. He takes it back to Pisa, and he finds that all his mates are still trying to do long division with CV, XVM, MV, CCC, all that sort of thing. So he writes a book, The Liber Abaci. And that book brings the Indian number system to Europe. So we have a relay race that starts with Aryabhatta in Pataliputra, to Brahmagupta in Mount Abu in Rajasthan, to the Sindh court, where the copy of Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta leave for Baghdad in 776. They're translated into Arabic in Baghdad, they spread across the Islamic world, and finally in 1120 Fibonacci translates Al-Khwarizmi, which contains the work of Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta, into Latin in 1120. It reaches the Holy Roman Emperor, and then as a final, another improbable twist, the Holy Roman Emperor brings Fibonacci to his beautiful castle, Castel del Monte, and he introduces him to a Scotsman, I'm glad to say, Michael Scott. And Michael Scott says to Fibonacci, it's all very well, but it's a bit theoretical, your book. We need weights and measures. We need currency conversion. We need 100 different practical uses that merchants can put this to. So Fibonacci writes the second edition dedicated to Michael Scott, and that goes viral in Italy. It's the basis for the Medici, it's the basis for the banking system, it's the basis for the European corporation. It's also the basis of Renaissance art. Piero della Francesco, one of the earliest Renaissance painters, writes 3 treatises on the mathematics of Fibonacci, which contains what he calls the modus indorum and the remarkable Hindu number system by which any number up to infinity can be expressed with the 9 numerals and 0. And out of it, he then takes this, his friend, Brian Luca de Caroli, takes this to Milan, where he shows it to his flatmate, and his flatmate is called Leonardo da Vinci. So this relay race goes forward step by step until Europeans are learning the mathematics of India by the 12th century. And it's now, finally, at this period, that you get the birth of the European Corporation, which I'm afraid to say comes back to India in the form of the East India Company. So you can argue that the Europeans use Indian weapons against India, that it is the genius of the Indian number system which allows the European Corporation to flourish and which eventually brings the company to these shores, Vasco da Gama and Calicut and all the rest of it. Anyway, the East India Company is another story for another day, but thank you so much for this time.
He's happy to take a couple of questions here, so if anybody has, we'll pass on back. Yes, Jen.
Hi, thanks a lot for this wonderful presentation. And in the last, you spoke about how Indian, I guess, like the genius was used against India. And one of the things that was instrumental in the colonization of India was the guns, right? And you can, I mean, I can't imagine what happening without the use of guns. So how would you substantiate your argument when the British had the guns, but India didn't, and I can't see a direct connection between India resulting in guns?
So this is the books I've been writing for the last 20 years about the East India Company. The last one was The Anarchy. So the actual story of the conquest of India by the British is told in that book. But it's not primarily a big difference of weaponry. The East India Company never has, in the 18th century, more than 250 white men in India. They use Indian sepoys against other Indian forces. They borrow their capital from Jain moneylenders and the Jugget sets, who are the big moneylenders of Bengal. So what is extraordinary is that the Europeans are sending armies of Indians against the Marathas, against the Mughals, against Tipu Sultan. It's never armies of white men. And that's the biggest surprise of all. It's true that there is the military revolution of the 18th century, but for example, the French are also training up Indians, and very quickly Tipu and the Marathas learn this technology. It's not sort of, it's not rocket science. It's very easy to found foundries, and within 30 years, the same weapons that Clive is using in Plassey are being used by the Marathas against the East India Company. So I would argue it's not primarily weaponry that's there, that it's the edge. It is the way that they're able to use Indian capital and Indian mercenaries against India. It's the disunited nature of the polities of India in this period. But that you'll find not in this book, but in The Anarchy, which tells exactly that story. So I'd recommend that book to you if you want to hear that. Any other questions? This gentleman here. Could we have a mic? The guy in the white coat.
The first question, where are you from? So any of the Europeans will agree your story. That is first thing.
But where am I from? I'm a Scot.
Okay.
But I've been living for 40 years in Delhi.
Okay. Then second thing is, any of the Europeans will agree your story. So whenever I am traveling to all the people everywhere, they are talking about different things in India. They know India as a some millionaire, lot of things they know about that. So what I am saying, whenever you are presenting this, what is the response from the Europeans?
So this book has been a bestseller in Europe and in India, but it's not a story that's well known outside India. No one, when I was going around Oxford and Cambridge 2 months ago telling these stories, no one has ever heard of Aryabhatta or Brahmagupta. There is nothing in the European or the American education system that talks about early Indian technology. We hear about ancient Greece, we know about Pythagoras, we know about Archimedes saying Eureka in his bath. That's taught from the age of 7. But the whole story of India's contribution is occluded. When we learn about the number system, it's described as the Arabic number system, which is not inaccurate, since the Europeans got it from the Arabs. It wasn't the Arabs that invented it. It was the Indians who invented it. So I think India has been very bad at telling its own story. There isn't a popular account which pulls all these things together. That pulls the technology, that pulls the story of Buddhism, that pulls the story of the spread of Hinduism and Sanskrit. It's an extraordinary story. What you have instead, I think, out there, is a lot of WhatsApp forwards about atomic weapons in the Mahabharata or Rishi-powered internet in the Vedic times and nonsense like this. And it's partly because I think Indians are aware that there is this great culture, but they haven't been given the full story of exactly when and how their civilization changed the world. So this is the reason I wrote this book, is to try and fill in the gaps. I mean, people are aware of some of those bits, like Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta, but how the Indian numbers got to the West is not something that people, I think, widely know. So there's all sorts of things I think you'll find in this book, which there are things that you may well know, like Angkor Wat, but there are other things such as the Burma kids in Baghdad, which you probably never have heard of, I suspect. So I recommend it to you. So.
We have to thank this man for putting the Indian history on the global historical narrative. I'd like to invite on stage Mr. Ratan Kelkar, our IT Secretary, to present a memento here. And I'd like to emphasize one more point here. We have been discussing over 3 days about how innovations of today and innovations for tomorrow are going to change our world. This man here came to us and spoke to us about the innovations of yesterday and made us see how we're all part of a dot and connected life.